If you've ever finished a FromSoftware game and just sat there like, what now? Yeah, same. That feeling where nothing else hits the same, combat feels too easy, bosses feel forgettable, and you just want that one more brutal, satisfying fight. But here's the thing. There are actually a ton of Souls-like games out there that get way closer to that feeling than people expect. Some of them even surprise you in ways Dark Souls never did. And today, we're diving into 20 of the best ones that prove FromSoftware doesn't own the formula. They just perfected it first. So, in this video, I've put together a list of Souls-like games that genuinely feel worth your time. Some are hardcore and punishing, some take creative risks, and a few might completely catch you off guard. Whether you're here for tight combat, dark worlds, or just that addictive one more try loop, there's something here for you. Let's get into it. Jumping into Lies of P, this one honestly surprised a lot of people, including me. At first glance, it feels like a straight-up Bloodborne clone with that dark, gothic city and creepy puppet enemies, but once you actually get into it, there's a lot more going on. The combat feels tight and weighty, especially when you start mastering the perfect guard system, which adds this extra layer of tension to every fight. You can't just roll your way out of danger, you actually have to learn enemy patterns and commit to your timing. The weapon customization is another standout, letting you mix and match blades and handles in a way that keeps things fresh the whole way through. And yeah, the story being based on Pinocchio sounds weird at first, but it actually works in a dark, twisted way that fits the world perfectly. Boss fights hit hard, the atmosphere is constantly tense, and by the time you're a few hours in, you stop comparing it to other games and just start enjoying it for what it is. Now moving into Lords of the Fallen, 2023. This one feels like a full-on attempt to recreate that classic Dark Souls vibe, but with its own twist, and honestly, it kind of works, but not without flaws. The first thing you notice is the atmosphere. It's dark, heavy, and almost oppressive in a good way, like the world just doesn't want you there. But what really makes it stand out is the whole dual-realm mechanic with Axiom and Umbral. Basically, when you die, you don't instantly lose, you get pulled into this nightmare version of the world where things get even more dangerous, and the longer you stay there, the worse it gets. It adds this constant pressure where you're thinking, do I risk pushing forward or get out now, which actually keeps exploration tense the entire time. Combat feels pretty satisfying too, especially once you get used to mixing dodges, parries, and heavier attacks, and the boss fights can genuinely hit that Souls-like sweet spot where you're locked in, fully focused, and one mistake can end it all. But yeah, it's not perfect. The game can feel a bit messy at times, especially with enemy placement and pacing, and earlier versions had performance issues that kind of held it back. The good thing is, over time it actually improved a lot with updates, making it a much smoother experience than it was at launch. At the end of the day, this is one of those games where if you love Souls-likes, you'll probably enjoy it despite its rough edges. It doesn't reinvent the genre, but it adds just enough new ideas to keep things interesting, and when it clicks, it really clicks. Then you've got Mortal Shell, and this one feels like a raw, stripped-down Souls-like that really leans into atmosphere and mechanics instead of throwing tons of content at you. The first thing you'll notice is how slow and deliberate everything feels. Every swing, every dodge, every mistake actually matters. But what makes it stand out is the whole shell system, where you basically take over the bodies of fallen warriors, and each one plays differently, almost like switching builds on the fly without the usual RPG grind. And then there's the harden mechanic, which is honestly the game's biggest twist. You can literally turn your body to stone mid-fight to absorb damage, and once you start using it properly, combat becomes this really satisfying mix of timing, baiting enemies, and countering at the perfect moment. It's one of those systems that feels weird at first, but when it clicks, it completely changes how you approach fights. That said, you will feel that this is a smaller game. There aren't a ton of weapons or bosses, and sometimes it can feel a bit limited compared to bigger Souls-likes, but at the same time, it nails that dark, lonely vibe and delivers a tight, focused experience that still scratches that Souls itch really well. It's not trying to be the biggest game out there. It's just trying to be a solid one, and honestly, it does a pretty good job at that. Next up is Nioh, and this is where things start to feel way more intense and technical compared to your typical Souls-like. Instead of just dodging and attacking, you're constantly managing your Kai, which is basically stamina, and the whole Kai pulse system becomes second nature after a while. At first it feels overwhelming, like there's too much going on, but once it clicks, combat becomes insanely satisfying. You're switching stances mid-fight, reading enemies, and reacting fast instead of just playing it safe. It almost feels like a mix between Dark Souls and a fast-paced action game, and that balance is what makes it stand out. The setting also does a lot of heavy lifting here, with that dark fantasy take on feudal Japan, mixed with yokai enemies that look straight out of a nightmare. Every mission feels handcrafted, and the boss fights can be brutal in the best way possible, the kind where you lose 10 times but still want to jump right back in. There's also a crazy amount of loot and build variety, which might not be for everyone, but if you enjoy experimenting with weapons and playstyles, you can easily sink a lot of time into it. It's definitely not the easiest game to get into, and yeah, it can feel punishing if you don't learn its systems properly, but once you do, it becomes one of the most rewarding combat systems in any Souls-like. And trust me, from here on, some of the next games take the formula in even more unexpected directions. Then you've got Wolong, Fallen Dynasty, and this one feels like a completely different energy compared to most Souls-likes. Instead of slow, methodical fights, everything here is fast, aggressive, and honestly kind of chaotic in a fun way. The biggest shift is the combat system, because there's no traditional stamina bar. Instead, you're working with this spirit gauge that rewards you for playing aggressively and landing hits, but punishes you hard if you mess up your timing. It creates this constant push and pull where you're not just surviving fights, you're controlling the flow of them. What really makes it click, though, is the parry system. Once you start deflecting attacks properly, especially those heavy critical blows, the whole game opens up. You go from barely surviving encounters to completely dominating them, and that transition feels insanely satisfying. It almost gives off Sekiro vibes, where skill matters more than stats, and once your timing improves, everything just feels smoother and more fluid. The setting is also pretty unique, with that dark Three Kingdoms-inspired world mixed with demons and supernatural enemies, which keeps things visually interesting throughout, but yeah, it's not perfect. The difficulty can feel a bit inconsistent at times, like some bosses hit way harder than expected while others feel easier than they should. Still, when the combat clicks, it's easily one of the most satisfying experiences in this entire list, especially if you enjoy fast-paced, skill-based gameplay. And trust me, we're just getting warmed up, because some of the next games take the Souls formula in completely different directions.
And just look at them. They were so starved they couldn't possibly have fought back.
Then we've got the Surge 2, and this one takes the whole Souls-like formula and throws it into a gritty sci-fi setting, which already makes it feel different from the usual dark fantasy vibe. Instead of knights and monsters, you're dealing with exosuits, drones, and a city that's basically falling apart around you. But what really makes this game stand out is its combat system, especially the limb targeting mechanic. You're not just hitting enemies until they drop, you're actually aiming for specific body parts, cutting them off, and using those parts to upgrade your own gear. It adds this extra layer of strategy where every fight feels like it has purpose beyond just surviving. Combat itself feels aggressive and rewarding. The game pushes you to stay on the offensive because your healing and abilities are tied to how actively you're fighting, so you can't just sit back and play safe all the time. At the same time, it still keeps that classic Souls-like tension where one mistake can cost you everything, especially when you're surrounded by multiple enemies and trying to manage stamina and positioning. The world design also leans into that interconnected, shortcut-heavy structure, so as you explore Jericho City, you start unlocking paths that loop back in really satisfying ways. That said, it's not perfect. The story is pretty forgettable and doesn't really pull you in, and sometimes the game can feel a bit samey after a while. But honestly, if you're here for gameplay, that's where it delivers. It's one of those games where the combat and progression carry the experience, and once you get into that loop of fighting, upgrading, and pushing forward, it becomes really hard to put down. And yeah, we're still not done, because the next few games start getting way more creative with the Souls-like formula. Then there's Code Vein, and this one is honestly one of the most unique takes on the Souls-like formula, mainly because it fully embraces that anime style instead of trying to stay grounded or realistic. Right from the start, the game throws you into this post-apocalyptic world with vampires, flashy abilities, and a heavy focus on story and characters, which already makes it feel very different from something like Dark Souls. One of the biggest highlights here is the character customization, and I'm not even exaggerating, it's insanely detailed. You can spend hours just creating your character before even starting the game, and it actually feels worth it because the game leans into that identity pretty hard. When it comes to gameplay, it follows the Souls-like structure pretty closely, with checkpoints, lost currency on death, and careful combat, but it adds its own twist with the blood code system. Basically, instead of being locked into one build, you can switch classes and abilities pretty freely, which makes experimenting way easier and more fun. On top of that, you usually have an AI companion with you, and unlike most games, they're actually useful. Sometimes a little too useful, to the point where they can carry fights if you're struggling. Now yeah, it's not perfect. Combat can feel a bit clunky and not as impactful as other Souls-likes, and the difficulty is definitely lower, especially with a partner helping you out. But honestly, that also makes it more approachable, especially if you're someone who finds traditional Souls games a bit too punishing. It's one of those games where the style, customization, and overall vibe carry the experience, even if the mechanics aren't the best in the genre. And trust me, the next few games start getting even more creative, especially when it comes to atmosphere and storytelling. Now let's talk about Thymesia, and this one is a bit of a hidden gem, but also a slightly messy one at the same time. From the moment you start playing, it feels like a fast, aggressive Souls-like that doesn't really care about stamina management. Instead, it pushes you into constant action, where you're chaining attacks, dodging quickly, and using a parry system that feels super tight when it works. The combat idea is actually really interesting, because enemies don't just have one health bar. They've got this layered system where you damage their armor first, then go for their real health, which makes fights feel a bit more strategic than your average hack and slash. It keeps you thinking instead of just swinging blindly. The Plague-themed world also does a lot of heavy lifting here. You play as a Plague Doctor-style character, and the environments feel dark, broken, and full of infected creatures that fit the tone perfectly. On paper, it sounds like something close to Bloodborne, and in some moments, it really gets that vibe right. But the game is also pretty short, and you can feel that it didn't have a massive budget behind it. Levels don't always feel fully fleshed out, and enemy variety can start to repeat itself a bit too quickly. Boss fights are probably the most memorable part. Some of them are genuinely intense and force you to learn the mechanics properly, while others feel a bit uneven or less polished. That's kind of the overall theme with Thymesia. When it hits, it feels really satisfying, but when it doesn't, you can tell it's holding back a bit. Still, if you're into Souls-likes and want something faster, tighter, and a little different from the usual formula, it's definitely worth checking out. Just don't expect a massive adventure like the bigger names in this genre. Now let's jump into Steelrising, and this one is kind of interesting because it feels like a Souls-like that quietly tries to do its own thing without making too much noise about it. Right away, the setting stands out. You're dropped into an alternate version of the French Revolution, but instead of humans fighting humans, it's basically clockwork machines taking over Paris. You play as Aegis, an automaton built for protection, and the whole world feels like it's stuck between elegance and total destruction. It has that gloomy, decaying atmosphere you'd expect, but with a steampunk twist that gives it a slightly different identity from other games in this genre. Combat is probably where Steelrising tries to separate itself the most. It's faster than a lot of traditional Souls-likes, almost encouraging you to stay aggressive instead of playing too defensively. Dodging feels quick, attacks are snappy, and stamina isn't as punishing as you'd expect, which makes fights flow a bit more smoothly once you get used to it. There's also a decent amount of build variety with different weapons and abilities, so you can lean into different playstyles depending on how you want to approach combat. But it's not all perfect. The game can feel a bit uneven at times, especially with enemy variety and pacing. Some fights feel really good and intense, while others start to repeat the same patterns a bit too often. And yeah, compared to heavier hitters in the genre, it doesn't always have that wow factor that keeps you hooked for hours without thinking. Still, what makes Steelrising worth mentioning is how accessible it feels. It doesn't try to punish you as much as some other Souls-likes, and that actually makes it a decent entry point if you want something similar but not overwhelming. It's not the deepest or most polished game in this list, but it definitely has its own identity, and when it clicks, it's a pretty solid experience overall. Now we've got Remnant II, and this is where the list takes a really interesting turn because it's not your typical sword and shield Souls-like. It's more like a Souls game mixed with a co-op shooter, and somehow it just works way better than it sounds on paper. From the moment you start playing, you can feel that it's built around experimentation. Every world you enter feels different, almost like the game is constantly remixing itself, so you're never fully sure what's waiting next. One run might feel like a dark fantasy wasteland, and the next suddenly throws you into something completely alien and surreal. That unpredictability is a huge part of what keeps it fresh, because you're not just memorizing patterns, you're adapting to whatever the game throws at you. Combat is where Remnant 2 really shines. Guns are your main tool here, but it still keeps that Souls-like tension with dodging, timing, and learning enemy attack patterns. It's fast, but not mindless fast. You still get punished for mistakes, especially during boss fights, which can feel absolutely intense when everything is happening at once and you're trying to survive just one more hit. And when you play co-op, the chaos multiplies in the best way possible. What really sets it apart, though, is the build variety. You're not locked into one playstyle at all. Different archetypes, weapons, and abilities let you completely change how you approach fights, and that makes replaying the game feel almost intentional rather than repetitive. On top of that, the world design constantly hides secrets and alternate paths, so even revisiting areas can lead to something new you didn't see before. It's not perfect, though. The story isn't really the main focus, and at times it can feel a bit confusing or undercooked. But honestly, most people aren't here for the story anyway. They're here for the gameplay loop, the builds, the bosses, and that just one more run feeling, and Remnant 2 absolutely delivers on that. And yeah, out of all the games on this list, this is probably one of the most replayable ones. Every run feels a little different, and that alone keeps it alive way longer than you'd expect. Next up, we're getting into some more story-driven and stylistic Souls-likes that go in a completely different direction. Then we've got Star Wars Jedi, Fallen Order, and this is probably the closest thing you'll get to a mainstream game accidentally turning into a Souls-like light without fully trying to be one. Right away, it gives you that familiar structure if you've played Souls games before. You've got meditation points that basically act like bonfires, enemies respawning when you rest, and that constant risk-reward loop where exploring too far might cost you everything you've collected. But at the same time, it never fully locks itself into being a hardcore Souls experience. It leans more into cinematic action and adventure, almost like Uncharted mixed with a bit of Sekiro-style combat. What really makes it stand out is the lightsaber combat. It feels weighty, deliberate, and when you start learning enemy timings, parries become incredibly satisfying. You're not just button mashing here, you're actually reacting, blocking, and waiting for openings like a proper Jedi fight should feel. And when the Force abilities start coming into play, the game really opens up, letting you throw enemies, slow time, and control fights in a way that feels powerful without being completely broken. The world design also deserves credit. Each planet feels like its own self-contained adventure, with shortcuts, hidden paths, and exploration that slowly loops back into itself, very similar to how Souls games structure their levels. There's a lot of backtracking too, but it usually pays off once you unlock new abilities and revisit old areas with fresh options. That said, it's not perfect. Combat can feel a bit less tight compared to true Souls-likes, and at times the pacing shifts more toward puzzles and platforming than constant fighting. Some people love that mix, others feel like it slows things down too much. But overall, it still manages to hit that challenge but not overwhelming balance really well, which makes it super approachable for a wider audience. And honestly, this is one of those games that proves you don't need to be brutally difficult to still capture that Souls-like feeling. It just wraps it in a more cinematic, story-driven package that works surprisingly well. Next up, things start getting a bit more indie, darker, and way more creative with the formula.
I hit him! Hurry! I missed!
Then there's Ashen, and this one is a bit of a quiet gem that most people skip, but once you play it, you kind of remember it for its vibe more than anything else. The first thing you notice is the art style. Everything has this soft, almost foggy look to it, like the world is constantly fading into itself. It doesn't go for flashy visuals or over-the-top effects, it goes for atmosphere, and that actually makes it feel really unique compared to other Souls-likes. The world feels lonely in a calm way, not just dark and aggressive, but more like something that's slowly dying and you're just moving through it. Combat is very stripped back, but that's kind of the point. It's slow, deliberate, and stamina-based, so every swing matters. You can't rush fights or spam attacks, because the game will punish you for it pretty quickly. What makes it a bit different, though, is the co-op system. Instead of always having AI companions, you often get matched with another player who can drop in and out of your world naturally, and that makes exploration feel less isolating without completely removing the tension. The game also doesn't hold your hand much at all. There's no constant guidance telling you where to go or what to do, so you end up learning the world through trial, error, and exploration. That can feel a bit confusing at first, but it also makes progress feel more rewarding when things finally click. Now, it's not a perfect game. Combat can feel a bit basic compared to heavier Souls-likes, and some areas don't have a ton of enemy variety. But what it does well is mood, pacing, and that quiet sense of discovery. It's not trying to overwhelm you, it's trying to pull you into its world slowly and honestly. It succeeds at that. And next up, we're moving into some absolute heavy hitters that defined the genre outside FromSoftware's shadow. Now let's talk about Hollow Knight, and even though it looks like a cute little 2D indie game at first, don't let that fool you for even a second. This game is brutal in the best possible way. From the moment you step into Hallownest, you can feel that same Souls-like energy, just translated into a completely different style. There's no hand-holding, no clear direction, and the game just drops you into this massive interconnected world and says, figure it out. And honestly, that's where it hooks you. Every area feels handcrafted, every path loops back into something you've already seen, and slowly the world starts making sense in your head like a giant puzzle. Combat is simple on the surface, but insanely tight once you get into it. You've got basic attacks, dodging, and your abilities, but timing is everything. Enemies don't forgive mistakes, and bosses especially feel like these intense rhythm fights where you're learning patterns, failing, and slowly getting better each attempt. And when you finally beat a boss you've been stuck on for a while, it hits that same satisfaction you get from Souls games. Maybe even harder because it feels like pure skill progression. What really makes Hollow Knight stand out, though, is the atmosphere. The world feels empty, but not in a dead way. More like a forgotten kingdom full of secrets and stories you have to piece together yourself. There's barely any direct storytelling, but everything from the environments to the music tells you something if you pay attention. It pulls you in without ever forcing anything on you. Now yeah, it can get tough. Sometimes really tough. Some sections and bosses will absolutely test your patience, and getting lost is basically part of the experience, but that's also what makes it so memorable. It doesn't guide you, it challenges you, and it trusts you to figure it out. And honestly, this is one of those games that doesn't just sit in the Souls-like inspired category, it kind of built its own identity inside it. Next up, we're heading into some darker, more emotional experiences that really push storytelling in this G. Now let's talk about Blasphemous II, and this one is basically what happens when a Soulslike gets mixed with pure Gothic art and religious horror, and then turned up to maximum intensity. Right away, the art style hits you. Everything looks handcrafted, almost like a dark painting that's constantly moving. The world is filled with symbolism, strange creatures, and this heavy religious tone that makes every area feel unsettling in a very unique way. It doesn't just look dark, it feels heavy, like the world itself is carrying some kind of punishment. Gameplay-wise, it's a big step up from the first game. Movement feels smoother, combat is more responsive, and you actually have multiple weapon styles that completely change how you approach fights. One moment you're using a fast rapier-style weapon, the next you're switching to something slow and heavy that hits like a truck. That flexibility keeps combat from ever feeling stale, and it pushes you to adapt depending on the enemy or boss you're facing. And speaking of bosses, yeah, this game doesn't hold back. Boss fights are intense, visually overwhelming, and often feel like you're fighting something way bigger than yourself. But the best part is how readable they become once you start learning patterns. It has that classic Souls-like loop where you struggle at first, then slowly everything starts clicking, and suddenly you're dodging attacks that used to destroy you without even thinking. What really makes Blasphemous II special, though, is its atmosphere and storytelling. It doesn't explain everything directly. Instead, it leaves you to piece together lore through environments, item descriptions, and visual storytelling. It's mysterious, a bit confusing, but also really rewarding if you pay attention. Now it's not perfect. Sometimes the world design can feel a bit overwhelming, and if you're not into slower exploration mixed with tough combat, it might not click right away. But if you're here for that dark, punishing, almost artistic Souls-like experience, this one absolutely delivers. And next up, we're getting into a couple of games that go even more old school with their difficulty and design philosophy. Now let's move into Lilies, Quietus of the Nights, and this one is a completely different kind of Souls-like experience, but it still hits that same emotional, atmospheric tone in a really strong way. At first glance, it looks soft and almost peaceful with its beautiful 2D art style, but the moment you start playing, you realize it's actually a pretty dark and heavy world underneath. You're exploring a ruined kingdom filled with corrupted knights and broken souls, and instead of directly fighting like a traditional action game, your main character is more fragile, relying on spirits you collect along the way to do most of the combat for you. That alone gives the game a unique identity, because you're not just swinging a weapon, you're building a set of abilities from fallen allies and shaping your playstyle around them. Combat is smooth and surprisingly responsive once you get used to it. You're constantly switching between different spirits, chaining attacks, and managing positioning so you don't get overwhelmed. It's not as aggressive as other Souls-likes, but it still punishes careless play, especially during boss fights where timing and movement matter a lot more than brute force. What really makes Lilies stand out, though, is its atmosphere and storytelling. There's almost no direct dialogue telling you what happened. Instead, you piece together the story through exploration, environmental details, and small narrative fragments. It creates this quiet, emotional tone where everything feels a bit tragic, like you're walking through the aftermath of something much bigger than you. And honestly, the music and visuals carry a lot of the experience. It's one of those games where you just sit back for a moment and take in the world, even when you're stuck. Now let's talk about Death's Door, and this one is a really clever little twist on the Souls-like formula, wrapped in a top-down action-adventure style that feels simple at first, but gets surprisingly deep. You play as a little crow who basically works as a reaper, collecting souls and dealing with strange, larger-than-life creatures in a world that feels both charming and slightly melancholic at the same time. The contrast is what makes it stand out. On one hand, everything looks almost cute and minimalistic, but on the other hand, the world is full of mystery, decay, and things that clearly went wrong a long time ago. Combat is very clean and focused. You've got light attacks, a bow, and a few abilities that you unlock as you progress, but nothing feels overloaded or complicated. What makes it interesting is how much the game relies on timing and positioning. Enemies don't give you much room to panic, so you end up learning patterns and reacting carefully, especially in boss fights where the screen suddenly fills with chaos and you're trying to survive just a few more seconds. Exploration is also a big part of the experience. The world is interconnected in a subtle way, and as you unlock new abilities, you keep revisiting old areas and finding paths you couldn't access before. It gives that same satisfying loop you get in Soulslikes, where progress feels earned rather than handed to you. Now it's not an overly long game, and some people might wish there was a bit more depth to the combat system, but honestly, its simplicity is kind of the point. It's focused, tight, and doesn't waste your time. And next up, we're heading into a couple of more experimental Souls-like games that try some really different ideas with combat and progression. Now let's jump into Star Wars Jedi, Survivor, and this one takes everything from Fallen Order and pushes it further in almost every direction. Right away, it feels bigger, more confident, and way more refined. The combat still has that Souls-like inspired structure with meditation points, punishing enemies, and timing-based parries, but this time it's smoother and more flexible. Cal feels faster, more powerful, and the different stances completely change how you approach fights. One moment you're using a heavy crossguard style that hits like a truck, the next you're switching to dual sabers for speed, and that variety keeps combat from ever feeling stale. What really stands out is how much more freedom the game gives you in movement and exploration. Traversal feels more fluid, with climbing, gliding, and faster mobility options that make exploring planets a lot less restrictive. Each area feels bigger and more alive, and there's always something tucked away that makes you want to check just one more corner before moving on. The story also hits harder this time. It feels more personal, more grounded, and Cal's journey has more weight behind it compared to the first game. Without getting into spoilers, there are moments that genuinely land emotionally, and it does a good job balancing cinematic storytelling with gameplay. Now, it's not perfect. Some performance issues and occasional pacing slowdowns can break immersion a bit, and at times the open areas can feel a little stretched out. But when the combat clicks and you're chaining parries, force abilities, and saber combos together, it feels incredible. And honestly, this is one of those games that shows how Souls-like mechanics can blend perfectly with cinematic action when done right. Now let's talk about Hellpoint, and this is one of those Souls-likes that feels like it came from a completely different direction compared to everything else on this list. Right away, the setting grabs your attention. Instead of medieval fantasy or dark plague worlds, you're dropped onto a massive abandoned space station floating near a black hole. And that alone changes everything. The environment feels cold, eerie, and unpredictable, like something went wrong here a long time ago and nobody ever fixed it. There's this constant feeling that you're being watched, even when nothing is there. Combat follows the classic Souls-like structure, with stamina-based attacks, dodging, and punishing enemies that don't give you much room to mess up. It's not the smoothest combat system in the world, but it does have weight to it. And when fights get intense in tight corridors or open sci-fi halls, it can actually feel pretty tense in a good way. One of the most interesting ideas in Hellpoint is the dynamic world system tied to the black hole. Basically, as time passes, the station changes states, which affects enemy behavior and events in the world. It's a cool concept that makes the environment feel a bit more alive and unpredictable, even if it's not always fully explored to its potential. Exploration is also a big part of the experience. The station is huge, interconnected, and full of shortcuts and hidden paths, so you're constantly finding new routes and slowly learning how everything connects together. It has that classic Souls-like structure where getting lost is part of the journey. Now, it's not a polished game. There are moments where animations feel stiff, combat can feel a bit clunky, and it definitely doesn't have the same production quality as bigger titles in the genre. But at the same time, it has personality. It feels weird, atmospheric, and different enough that it sticks with you. And that's kind of Hellpoint in a nutshell. It's not trying to compete with the biggest Souls-likes out there. It's just doing its own strange sci-fi thing, and if you vibe with it, it actually becomes a pretty memorable experience. Now let's talk about Salt and Sanctuary, and this one is basically what happens when you take Dark Souls, shrink it into a 2D world, and somehow still keep that same brutal energy intact. From the moment you start, it doesn't really hold your hand at all. You're dropped into this dark, decaying world full of strange creatures, ruined castles, and a constant feeling that everything wants you dead. Even though it's side-scrolling, it still carries that classic Souls-like tension where every corner could hide something dangerous, and every fight actually matters. Combat is surprisingly deep for a 2D game. You've got different weapon types, magic, shields, and a stamina system that forces you to think before you swing. You can't just spam attacks or rush enemies, because the game will punish you fast. It still has that familiar loop of dying, learning, and slowly improving until you finally push past whatever was stopping you. What really makes Salt and Sanctuary stand out is how close it feels to the original Souls experience, just in a completely different perspective. The world design is interconnected in a way that slowly starts making sense as you explore more, and the build variety lets you experiment with different playstyles, from heavy knights to magic-focused builds. It's not a flashy game, and it definitely looks rough around the edges compared to modern titles, but that's part of its charm. It feels raw, dense, and focused on gameplay above everything else. And honestly, if someone told you a 2D game could capture the Souls-like feeling this well, you probably wouldn't believe it until you played it yourself. Perfect. Let's wrap it up strong with Asterigos, Curse of the Stars. And yeah, this is a really fitting final entry because it feels like a more approachable Souls-like that still keeps the spirit of the genre alive. Right from the start, it leans into a myth-inspired fantasy world that feels a bit lighter compared to the usual dark and heavy tone you expect from Souls-likes. You're exploring a city filled with gods, monsters, and ancient secrets, and the whole setting has this almost storybook-style presentation, but still with enough danger and mystery to keep that tension alive. Combat is where Asterigos really tries to stand out. Instead of locking you into one weapon style, it lets you swap between different weapons and abilities on the fly, so you can go from sword and shield to magic attacks or ranged options depending on the situation. It makes fights feel more flexible and gives you room to experiment without restarting your whole build. It's not as punishing as traditional Souls games, but it still rewards timing, dodging, and learning enemy patterns. The bosses are probably where the game shines the most. They're designed with clear attack patterns and phases, so once you learn them, the fights become really satisfying instead of just overwhelming. It gives you that same "I finally did it" feeling, just in a more forgiving way. Now, it's not the hardest game on this list, and hardcore Souls players might find it a bit too accessible. But that's also kind of its strength. It opens the door for newer players who want that Souls-like feeling without getting completely destroyed every 5 minutes.
Staff, spear, bracelets, and my daggers. All right.
And honestly, as the final game in this list, it works well because it shows how flexible the genre has become. From brutal hardcore experiences to more approachable action RPGs, Souls-likes are no L